Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is James Shelley, and welcome to the third part of our kind of conversation series focused on the topic of uncertainty, and especially the intersection of uncertainty and leadership or leading through uncertainty. So to give you a quick introduction of who will be joining me in discussion today, we have Kendra Ferris, who works in the public sector. She has a special interest in libraries and the power of words. Kendra's joining us from Brampton, Ontario. Janet Frood is the founder of the Horizon Leadership Institute. She is an executive leadership and team coach. You're joining us from London, Ontario, I believe, where I am as well today. Melissa Maloney, also joining us from London here, is the founder of Happy Leader Enterprises and the co-founder of All Women Lead. Maxwell Smith is a bioethicist and assistant professor in the School of Health Studies at Western University. And Julian Summer Hayes is joining us from the real London, the bigger London, England. He's an in-house lawyer, coach, and blogger. So thank you everyone for jumping in and being a part of this discussion today. To get us rolling, to get us thinking, and to begin creating a space for us to unpack uncertainty. I was reflecting this morning as kind of a case in point on uncertainty, that when I sent an email, I think I emailed most of you on or around May 15th about being a part of this discussion. And I was reflecting this morning about how much has changed since May 15th. On May 15th, George Floyd was still alive. The President of the United States was not writing executive orders against social media companies. So much of the environment that we're having this conversation in right now, the social political environment, was something that is different and we couldn't have maybe expected just even 14 days ago. And it's not that 14 days ago we didn't know that police brutality was a serious issue. It's not that we didn't know that structural systemic racism wasn't an issue. It's not that we didn't know that Twitter had a particularly problematic user on its hands, but there was no way to know 14 days ago. I think how salient and how prevalent maybe those particular issues would be today. And then that makes me think even further, let's suppose we weren't having this conversation today. Let's suppose we were going to be thinking about having this conversation in another 14 or 15 days from now. Who knows? Who knows that context? Who knows the political, social environment that we'd be having that discussion in? We just don't know. There's also this pandemic you probably heard of that's happening right now too. That frame of coming to terms or coming to grips with just how little we can see, anticipate, and understand the future is really the purpose of these discussions. And so to begin, I wonder if I could just invite each one of you to maybe set a bit of the agenda for how we'll explore this topic by sharing what you think, given your reflection over the last couple of weeks and months, or given your reflection in preparation for this conversation. What do you see as some of the most critical issues or the most important angles that we should take when thinking about uncertainty? Begin, Janet Frood, would you mind just kicking us off? What do you think we need to make sure we think about in this conversation?
Yeah, the notion of uncertainty is really interesting because I think this is a really profound reminder that how we relate to uncertainty is part of the story that we have as individuals. It's part of how we have that as part of, a lived experience, whether it's within the context of our work, our personal lives. And so I think that we all have a relationship with it. It's a new frame. It's more that what's new is the pandemic part of it. But I think that it's, if I think about the work that I've been doing and engaging on it, even in myself, but with the leaders that I work with, it's this notion of how how can we pay attention to the different perspectives that people hold on uncertainty? Some people are very adaptable. Some people are kind of like, in a way, kind of, this is cool. This is a really interesting time. Whereas other people, it triggers something based on past lived experiences and it amplifies. And so we as humans make up stories when we need to have certainty. And I think that there's a whole lot of stories that are being made up. Some people are consuming formal channels of information, but others have gone into, in the coaching world, we talk about when people go into realm, like they're overwhelmed by this. And so I think it's just remembering that there's a lot of need for perspective taking and generosity, of reminding ourselves that people are doing the very best that they can. And the distinction, I lean into the work of William Bridges, and he talks about transition versus change. Change is an event. The pandemic is an event. And when there's an event, we like to try and find, what do we do about it? So we're on this, worldwide quest to get a vaccine. We want to flatten the curve. We want to reduce the number of deaths and infections. When we think about work, we're trying to figure out, how do we adapt so people can work safely? So that's change. But transition is deeper. It's the psychological process that people go through and how they try and make meaning of something. And there's different phases of that, and so it's really interesting. So just from a lens of leadership, how do we take a pause to understand people's uncertainty relationship and what that means for them?
The word that keeps coming up, and Janet said it a couple of times, and James said it a couple of times, is how, right? And something that I've been really interested in is, in this time of uncertainty, where we have different choices in front of us, where we're making different choices. I'm so interested in how people are making those choices, and in all of the everyday routines that we're having to adapt and change. What is the thought process that's going through people's minds, and how are people thinking about these things differently? Because I think like the moment pause comes to me as well, because it's also like we're like, things for some people have slowed down a little bit, and we're thinking about things a little bit more. And it's so interesting to me to hear those things. And that's something that I'm interested to engage with all of you folks about as well, to get some different brains and some different ideas about how we are managing in this moment. And I'm really glad that James kind of brought up the change and kind of the new things, not new in terms of like the global experience, but the nuance of now having race riots happening in the United States, right, in this moment. And because then that's another, like, how are we thinking about race? How are we thinking about our relationships? How are we thinking about how we show up in the world? Right. So I think that's another thing that, like, I'm certain that we need to have that conversation, and I'm uncertain about how folks are ready to do that, and very interested in figuring out how to bring some of that dialogue. And it's something that I'm doing in my own life, and it's messy and it's a little bit yucky, as uncertainty is, but it's something that I'm making a conscious effort to do in this time as well.
I would say, just to sort of add to what's already been said, one of the things that I've spoken a lot about, and really I'm trying to sort of keep front of mind for everybody, is everybody deals with ambiguity differently. And I have a philosophy in life that works for me, that most people are really uncomfortable with, because my response to almost any situation is, we'll figure it out. And that's just my answer. It's like, we'll find an answer, we'll figure it out. And to what Janet said, I have life circumstances that have kind of created my ability to be really good at that, because I was forced at a young age to figure stuff out. And so it's a very rare event that I can't find a solution. However, in leading people, I've learned over the years how uncomfortable people are in that place of ambiguity. And for us to be in this position where we've gone, I think initially sort of it was like, okay, 2 weeks. I can deal with 2 weeks. And then it was, okay, 4 weeks. Yeah, 4. I got 4. And as it's dragged on, and now it's like, is it ending? It's like that ambiguity's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. and then people are less and less comfortable in it, and especially if it's not something that you're comfortable in normally. So it's expanding, and so I think that that's something that I've really reflected on a lot, is how do we support people through that ambiguity, and how do we help? And I've spoken a lot about in the webinars and things that I've done about communication. And I feel like right now, the people who are really rising through this are the people who have communication being given to them. The companies that are excelling right now are the ones that are communicating, because when there's no communication, people fill in the gap with whatever their biggest fear is or whatever their story is. And so the smaller we can make the gap, to me, it's like, how do we make that gap smaller so that people feel more confident in the unknown? And so I really think there's a lot to sort of be reflected on in that, is what are those pieces that we can do in those areas to help lessen the ambiguity and fill in the gaps?
So it's kind of interesting to me that we talk about uncertainty as a state of affairs that seems to be just pervasive and is the reality during this pandemic and more generally. But I think uncertainty is seen as a problem, right? And I think because it's a problem, we're searching for the antidote to the problem. And of course, the antidote to uncertainty is certainty. And so in decision-making, I think, at all the tables that I'm sitting at and trying to think about how to respond to this pandemic, we're striving for certainty. And so you can see that in, antibody tests for vaccines. We want to know with 100% certainty that this will be effective, or this will be the outcome. And I think that's a fool's errand, right? I think it's not problematic to try to reduce uncertainty, but I don't think we can presume that we'll reach any level of certainty anytime soon. So I think the pivotal question really is, how do you operate in a context of uncertainty, not just always striving for certainty? And I think everyone sort of said something along these lines, but I think the key question in leadership and decision making in a context of uncertainty is, how do you enhance and engender legitimacy and accountability in making decisions where certainty doesn't exist, right? Because if we can just rely on certainty, then we can just say, look, this is precisely what the data says. The data are certain, and it says this is the right way to go. In the absence of that, then we can't lean on that, and we need to make decisions still in a legitimate and an accountable manner. And so it's the mechanism to engender legitimacy and accountability, I think, that we need to be really focused on. And I think that goes back to Janet's first point, that it's part of that will include engaging the perspectives of those that are affected by decisions in contexts of uncertainty. That will work to enhance or engender legitimacy and accountability for those decisions.
So I'm going to come at this slightly differently, and thank you, James, and thank you to everybody for coming together. I think I'm the only lawyer in this group. I'm just about a lawyer, shall we say, because I've dabbled with it. And so if I look at the word uncertain, which from an etymological point of view rather than a dictionary point of view, it means not fully confident. Now, bound up in that is also language. And so when I look at the UK's position on COVID-19 as an example of leadership, there was a great deal of confidence that herd immunity was the right approach. Now, we have the highest death rate in Europe. Now, that is not my idea of confident leadership. That's anything but. And so I think in this pandemic, what I've seen is, and it goes back to Melissa's point about communication, is language hasn't really been thought of very carefully. And I would have been much happier if people said, we don't know the answer. And there's been too much hyperbolic speech. And I'm not going to comment on Donald Trump, because all I'm reading is what I'm reading in the UK, so I'm not close enough to it. But certainly in the UK, we've now had the incident with Dominic Cummings, where it does seem that there's one rule for one and a different rule for everybody else. Again, that's not my idea of leadership. So if I think of the word uncertain, it means not fully confident. And I think there's nothing wrong with a leader. And there's a gender issue here, which you may get to in relation to the female leaders who've obviously been held up as dealing with the COVID crisis much better. But in terms of the leadership traits that I would be looking for, I wouldn't have had a problem if somebody who had put their hand up at the beginning and said, you know what, I don't really know what to say to you today because I don't know enough. And pushing the scientists to the front and hoping the scientists would lead when the scientists themselves probably didn't have the whole thing mapped out, didn't know enough. So, you know, I'm looking at the language from a legal point of view because that's where I start from. And I think the language in this hasn't been very helpful. And I don't think it's very helpful still, to be honest with you. So this isn't a dig at anybody. It's just saying I think we could learn an awful lot by dealing with, as I say, the language around uncertainty. What, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying I don't know once in a while.
I'd love to build off of Julian's point, because one of the things that I've witnessed around leaders, leaders by nature want to give answers, give direction, be clear. What I've witnessing is that leaders are having to sit in their own vulnerability and uncertainty right now and not knowing. And some are quite brave and straight up and say, I don't know the answer, but this is what we're doing. And that does create a sense of you know, stability and calm for people. It's not always the answers, it's are we talking? The other thing that I've been witnessing is that we're in a new dimension. One of the things that is being birthed in this is actually more conversation, which is rooted in emotions. So if leaders can lead with their vulnerability and understanding, you know, what I know, what I don't know, and acknowledging it, it's creating space that is shifting the way that people that work together are engaging. And I think that that is, if there is a gift in this, I actually think that's one of the gifts, because we need more emotional literacy, we need more emotional agility, and we need the relationships. Relationships will take us through this to the other side in whatever form, I don't know, but it's the way that we need to stay connected. So really appreciate, Julian, where you pointed us.
I think to expand on what Janet was saying, sort of again tagging into what Julian said, and political parties, and I'll say as nonpartisan as humanly possible in this, is I think if we look to somebody who most of us in Ontario are watching, and we look at somebody like Doug Ford and what he has brought to the table, whether you're conservative or not, I think we've seen a very human leader in him. I think he's admitted when he doesn't know the answers. I think he's admitted when things are bothering him as well. And I do hope that we can see more of that. I think we're sort of seeing the difference between what happens when there's talking points used and what happens when there's real feelings and emotion used. And I think if we kind of reference back, that's what we're seeing in some of the female leaders who have really sort of been highlighted in how well they've handled all this, is they're humans and they're acting like humans. And I know for me, that's one of the things I've watched the majority of the press conferences as this has all gone on. And that's one of the things for me that really, looking at how Ford has presented himself, I feel he's presented himself as a human in this. And we've seen emotion, we've seen a real person. And I think all leaders, the ones that I think are really excelling through this are the ones who are being open and honest and transparent with how they're feeling as well. Because when people around you are scared, it's not always, you don't have to be the person who's not scared. And I think people connect more with your leadership when you're real. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to learn from this going forward with that.
There's a couple of pieces, because there's a couple of words that I've been kind of like writing down as folks have been talking. And one of them was silence, because I think that would be like I think it was Melissa, forgive me if I got this wrong, but who said that the people who have information are empowered to do well. People who are being communicated with are the ones who are thriving and or who are better set up to be successful through this. And I think that's the comfort that we're seeing with people coming forward and giving a news conference that maybe doesn't have that much content, but it's sharing what they know. Right? And doing it on a regular basis and having a point where people can come for reliable information on a regular basis. And if the alternative to that is silence, I think that's like, it's really wonderful that folks are showing up and having something to say, whereas that's something that we've not seen from leadership, and having even seeing the face of the premier every day in an informal setting, like that is something that is incredibly unusual, and it's kind of refreshing, because I know, like, so flipping this into like the professional dimension, being able to see, like even seeing folks in their own homes, like it's totally shifting the whole dynamic of what professionalism, what our discourse is, and how we see people in leadership settings. And it's incredibly refreshing. And it's also showing that like people can criticize folks for making mistakes, but that's actually the nature of it. We're just seeing it, right? We're seeing it in a different way. And I'm here for it, and I commend the folks who are out there and who are putting themselves, and it comes back to what Max was saying about accountability, because at the end, like leadership, you're accountable for this, and so you putting yourself as a face and a voice to it is really encouraging to see.
Kendra, and I think the interesting thing is if you come out and say, this is the information I've got, and it's not perfect, but this is what I've got, then you become accountable for that information. So I think there's an aversion to doing that and would rather not even come out and say that. So I think what's important is if you're willing to come out and say, this is the information we have, such as it is, to appreciate that information is defeasible, right? That we might come back at a future point and say, look, that was incorrect, or we have better information now, and we're actually shifting or reversing our stance on this. And I think that's an important part of accountability, and I think that's an important part of actually engendering trust in our decision makers.
And creating that world where leaders don't have to be perfect. Like, it's okay to say, I did that wrong, or I had some wrong information, and you know what? Sorry if I need to apologize for something, and just that humbleness, it's critical. And I think, again, hopefully we'll see more people gaining that skill from this.
And the piece as well about, we have better information now, so we're making a different decision. I think that because that's something that we've been reaching for a very long time. There's a quote that I wish I had like ready, locked, and loaded to say about that being wisdom, is when you have new information, you make a better choice. Right. So I think that's something that hadn't come to me, but think about how frustrating folks have been about the, do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? Do I wear gloves? Do I not wear gloves? And because we're all figuring it out. And so I think like a lot of what we're seeing is all of the things that we talk about as important leadership skills. And I think that makes people uncomfortable though, because we want it to be simple, right? And I think that when I was thinking about certainty, like it's a myth. Like the big thing I wrote was the end of the myth of certainty, because it's a simplicity. Like we want things to be simple. We want things to be easier, but we're in a very complex time and working our way through all of that.
My worry is perhaps that it is seen as a complex time. So people will say, this is an uncertain time. And so that might actually permit us to be a little bit more human and present our decisions and information in this way. I worry that once we're out of a pandemic and we're in a recovery phase, we can't lean on this is an uncertain time anymore. And so we'll expect more certainty, when in fact we have maybe not just as much, but certainly nearly as much uncertainty in non-pandemic times as well.
I think somebody may have used the word, but I've got 3 children, so they're 3 girls and they span the ages 16 to 23. And I think what they abhor is over-professionalism. And we had a statement by Dominic Cummings, which was over-lawyered, and everybody could see that it had been done to death by lawyers. So he wasn't saying it, he was reading from something. And they will WhatsApp message me. So when Boris Johnson is speaking, you know, in the beginning, it was going okay, but the sort of messages, which I won't embarrass them by repeating, that I'm getting now are anything but nice, shall we say, because what they are not getting is they're not getting authenticity. They know that they're being flanneled and waffled, and they're not getting the right, it's not so much the right answers. They know that this thing is developing, it's changing, it's you know, you can't predict what's going to happen to one day's next, but they just want somebody to turn up there and be themselves. So I think professionalism, I never really understood, I heard this word a lot in the 80s, I never really understood what professionalism means, because we talked about authenticity, being human, everything else. I don't know where that fits with professionalism. Can you be professional? Does that mean wearing a suit and tie? Which again, I don't necessarily need to see somebody reading the weather. I have a thing about weather people wearing a suit and tie, or women getting dressed up. You know, it's the weather, for heaven's sake, you know, I can get it on my phone, right? Again, my kids just they want it straight. And so I do worry a bit whether leadership is becoming a bit over professionalized now. I don't know. That's my only observation. Sorry.
I'd love to add in something that I've been noticing. And I was working with a team the other day, and in the conversation, I said it just came out of me. I don't think I'd consciously thought of it, but it's around certainty. And it's like the one thing I am certain of is that people will come through this changed. The people that we sent home to go work remotely, when they come back into work, they come back different. And where that took me in my own reflection is I think we're going through a values reevaluation as well. Because what people, cared about before pre-COVID, and now that we're in it and we're having this experience, I think it's awakening for people things which are like, what do I really care about? What is most important? We've been seeing parents struggle. Do I do the lessons at school and have my child in tears, or do I just let it go? What's more important here? So I think there's something about, and I think it's not uncommon when people have trauma in their life, or if there's major life or even cultural experiences, we see a shift in values. So that's where my curiosity is sitting. It's going to be human. I think it's going to be organizational. I think it's going to be, country and cultural in terms of the value shifting that is going to happen. So maybe it's like, instead of it being the demographics of different cohorts based on when they're born, it's sort of like the COVID effect and what will emerge as we come through and out of this. But I see people rumbling internally right now around their own personal values. So when we come back together in community, I think that that's going to have a different shape.
So as you're speaking, all of you, it's especially drawing these pieces together around communication and uncertainty and leadership. Seems to be a thread weaving through. And a thought that I had while you were all talking was the idea of, like, I will use this gender term, and I'm using this gender term intentionally. The idea of the strong man and the strong man leader, is often something we associate with a kind of leadership that often arises in crisis. And I don't want to conflate crisis with uncertainty. Those are different things, but you can often have uncertainty around times of crisis. And what I hear us saying is, like, the opposite to that, the strong man, the I have the answers, I will lead you safely through, follow me mode of leadership is not actually weakness, it's honesty. It's saying, here's what I actually know. It's imperfect, it's provisional. And if this could all change tomorrow, but that's not weakness. What that is a courage to be accountable to the decisions that you're making without certainty, as Max was saying. At the end of the day, leadership is holding this responsibility of being forced to make decisions with imperfect information and being then held accountable for the outcome of those decisions you made when you didn't have all the data. And so I'm curious about a lot of things, but one of the things that is coming to me as you're all speaking is, we have choices about the voices that we listen to as a population right now, all around the world. There are some political leaders who we might say are extremely honest, who have no space between the thought in their head and the fingertips at their Twitter account. And so that could also be, that's honest, transparent leadership, right? And I don't think we're necessarily saying that's the kind of leadership that we want. However, that is it's very compelling for a very large number of people. So I wonder if we could speak to that. For the sake of the thought experiment, let's take ourselves out of the leadership lens for a second, but put on the follower lens. How do we make decisions right now about who we listen to? And then maybe we can reflect on then how that shapes some of our ideas about leadership. That was a lot. Anyone want to take something from there?
I can start with that. I think if I step back and reflect on myself and sort of who do I follow, I connect into the people I think that align with my value system, and even as a leader, that's what I've always tried. That's where I've always tried to sort of start from. That's usually the basis of my decision making, is how does this affect my values, and does this align with my values? And I feel like, and right now in this time of uncertainty, and again, I'm somebody who sits very comfortably in this space, but right now, for me, it very much is, I'm looking for the person who's open to other people's views and perspectives and not shutting people down. I really feel like in this, I think right now we have to really realize that everyone's dealing with this very differently, and we have to be open to trying to understand other people's point of views. I think we have to be really open to trying to learn where people are coming from right now. And I think we have to be open to forgiving mistakes, since we don't know the right answer. And so I really, for me, sort of stepping back and looking at the leadership as a follower and coming from that perspective, I connect and respond to the people who are trying to be empathetic to the masses and who are trying to consider other people's point of view. Because I also think that's when, if we're more concerned about being open to learning than being right, I just find that's how we progress forward. And whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about some of the situations going on with the race things right now, whether it's Twitter, like, again, it's if we're trying to take it from the perspective of, are we being open to learning right now and understanding right now, or am I really just trying to be right? And I think the more we can sort of sit in that space of learning, the more opportunity there is to move forward.
So in the UK, I don't know how it's played out elsewhere, but you may have seen that they've used a World War II metaphor. So they've essentially said that we're in wartime conditions effectively. And obviously we've got Winston Churchill, who was the then leader in a coalition party. But there's a world of difference in a number of ways between Churchill's form of leadership and the leadership we've got now. I think one of the big issues is the amount of information that's available to people. Because if you know anything about Churchill, everybody would sit around the radio and listen to his broadcasts. And apart from perhaps a few newspapers as well, there wasn't an awful lot of information. But now, of course, you've got an abundance of information and fake news and all of that sort of stuff. So I think it must be an incredibly hard job for any leader in any role to maintain a degree of consistency in what they're saying when it's so easy for them to be undermined. I mean, I work in an organization where we have a daily email, and I can't imagine how long it takes for that email to be produced, probably way too long. But the conversation I've had with people is everybody seems to have an opinion about that email. You know, even to the extent that somebody's used the words "our government," and people say, well, it's not my government because I didn't vote for them. But that's the advice. So I think what I'm saying, I think as a follower, it's very easy to be cynical these days and skeptical about what you're being told, because it's so easy to go to Google or somewhere else to find out whether what you're being told in your world is true or whether it's wholly true. So my only observation would be that we're not in certainly for me, it doesn't feel like a wartime condition. My parents were born in the Second World War, so I've got their experiences. And in any event, I think for any leader in any role, I think it's incredibly difficult because of that very thing, as I've said, about their dissemination of whatever information being undermined.
I'm going to go in a really different direction. So as a human and as a follower, one of the things that I have been trying to do is listen. I guess I'm going more internal, listening to the inner voice, the inner horizon. For anybody that knows the poetry and the work of David White, I've been doing a program that he's been doing, a series where he's been talking about courage and vulnerability. But he talks about the difference between the external horizon, what we see, who's influencing us, but it's the internal horizon and going inside to access wisdom. So if I'm listening to a voice right now, my practice is to go to nature. and to actually connect in with what I'm witnessing and seeing in nature, and reminding myself that nature is probably the best example of what do we do in the face of uncertainty. So if you think about forest fires, how there can be regeneration, the restorative power that lives in nature. And so what I've been trying to do is tap into how can I access that for myself? Because I'm going to be honest, I've been getting overwhelmed by all of those external voices. And because there's so much conflicting information, that's not making me feel grounded or steady. It's actually making me feel frustrated and a bit of despair. And I think by nature, I tend to be more of an optimist. I'm trying to find the possibility. And so nature for me is a voice. There's wisdom, indigenous wisdom about the practice of how do we do more restorative practice. So I know it's a very different direction, but for me, it's another voice. And I think it's a very powerful voice that if we, and I think it's also, is this also part of the pause? Because how many people are actually finding themselves walking back into nature because that's the one thing they can do? And so are we making space for a new voice and new information to come towards us? So
I love what you're saying about new voices and new information. And that's something that it's just tying together a couple of things, legitimacy, right? So nature is something that you can point to, and you know where it is, and you know where to seek it, and you know where to find it. Right? And I think something that I've been struggling with in this moment as more experiences of things that I will never experience in my life have been coming through social media, through the news, whether that's people's pandemic experiences where they're not working at home and where they're having to go out and are experiencing customers who are frustrated and angry, and not people who don't want to wear masks and don't want to follow rules, but then also people who are experiencing violence that I will never know anything about. And what there's been lots of resources going around, but one of the things that has kind of like shifted my thinking on this is reaching out for voices and for experiences, and following more people on Twitter and on Instagram who are putting different content in front of me. So because that inevitably shapes what's on my radar, it shapes what I'm aware of, it shapes what I'm thinking about. And I think that, like, for me, the thing to do in this moment is to reach for those voices and to listen and to pay attention to what's being said, because the luxury, something I've been thinking a lot about in this moment is there's luxury and there's responsibility, right? So I have the luxury of not having to experience that horror. So I have the responsibility to listen and also to think about how, like, what my place is in that, and how I perpetuate those things. And someone who I'm lucky to have people in my life who challenge me. And in the context of this week, he asked me, what are the times when I've been an Amy Cooper? What are the times when I have, and so Julian, this is the dog walker in Central Park who weaponized 911 against a man who had the audacity to tell her that she was doing something incorrect, right? And that's been something that I'm not going to lie, it weighs heavily on me, because I know that there are times when I've done that in less violent ways and less harmful ways, but I've been that person. And so, like, those voices that are reminding me of when I'm not right and when I've made mistakes, it's heavy, but it's something that I've been sitting with and being more attentive to in this, particularly this week, but in this time in general.
It's very difficult to add to all those really, really important reflections. But I mean, I think the only thing I would add is, thinking about, in response to your question, James, both the personal and perhaps the structural elements or dimensions of what we might bring to bear when we're thinking about who do we follow and why, what are we looking for in terms of leadership. I think I think trustworthiness is central to that. And I think trustworthiness is interesting because as an individual, I can, trust can be engendered, for me, and I might trust personally or individually a leader or decision maker. But trust is very systemic as well. It has a systemic dimension. And, so we've talked about our premier in Ontario, Doug Ford, and you might trust what Premier Ford has to say about a particular issue, or even trust him throughout the pandemic. But there might be pretty significant systemic mistrust, right, of your premier or of that government, or, you know, so on and so forth, which I don't think goes away with any particular decision or piece of information. That really takes a lot of undoing to build that trust up so that you have trustworthiness again. And so it's a much bigger project when we're thinking about how do you handle uncertainty in this context, and as a follower, how do you engage with that if trustworthiness is the goal? It's a much bigger conversation.
Just for the record, I also am an avid poetry buff, so I do know David Whyte's work. So I've gone back to Mary Oliver as well. So I actually was on a call the other day where I gave somebody a copy of Wild Geese because they were struggling a bit, and it just immediately came to me. So I'm very much with you. I live next to Dartmoor. James has sort of placed me a little bit further east, but I actually live in the southwest, so I can actually walk out and be in nature very, very easily. And I suppose more than anything else, that's enabled me to, and it sounds very cliche, to ground myself, because I read voraciously for the first 2 weeks. And then I almost turned off everything because I was overwhelmed. I couldn't actually establish one thing from another. My wife is a nurse, and she's actually on the front line. She works in accident and emergency, so she's actually treating people coming in. So I know the reality of personal protective equipment and all of that. So you know, if I need to know it, I can ask her. So yeah, I think that restorative point, and I do love what you said, Janet, about people coming back from it being changed. I've seen a lot of people saying just that. And in fact, I don't know where the movement is going to go to. Certainly in the professional services market, you've had big vanity buildings where everybody's piled into these huge offices in London. Now, of course, everybody's been working remotely. And I wonder from a leadership point of view, how you then manage the transition where people say, do you know what, I don't want to work in the office anymore, because I'm actually more productive working from home. And you've got the numbers because you've been monitoring me and all that sort of stuff. So where's the legitimacy in bringing me back, particularly if you've got, you know, you've had to juggle everything from looking after your children, perhaps looking after older people or whatever it is. And now all of a sudden you've got your life sort of okay. And you can see it would be even better when the children go back to school, wherever it is. So yeah, I think there's a huge thing around that that's going, and we're only just starting to see the beginning of that because they've loosened up the lockdown on Monday. So yeah, I think that's a massive piece, Janet. Yeah, and thank you for raising that. That's a really good piece. Yeah.
Sorry, Julian, for confusing your time zone with the actual city that you're in.
I'll let you off, James. It's okay.
I'll pay more attention. I will pay more attention. I was probably just insecure about, you know, my London versus the London that's near you, and so this thread of being wrong is a fascinating subtext to this conversation. So many of the things we've touched on seem to come back to this willingness to be wrong. There's so many other angles that I would love to explore. The shape of how technology and how technology shapes information, and then how information shapes who we are in this moment is so fascinating as well. I mean, we're having this conversation using this technology, which is terrific. And if we were all stuck in a pandemic without this, I mean, this would be such a different story. I don't know what it would be, but it would obviously be different than this. And then at the same time, while we're kind of acknowledging that, hey, you know, if you got to be in a lockdown, it's really nice to have technology like this. We're also saying this is essentially the same technology that's causing us some anxiety. It's causing us stress and forcing us to make these decisions about, you know, what our inputs are, and you know, trying to wrestle through the parameters of how we make those decisions about what our inputs are. This other piece about the status quo or going back to something. One thing I am increasingly just becoming more uncertain about is that itself. I don't know how strong the inertia of the status quo is once the pressure points of the pandemic are released. I just don't know. I feel like I just feel like I can't predict that. I have no idea. Will some of us rush back into the office towers, or Julian, like you said, will some of us just be like, well, you have to, you know, justify to me why you need to put me in that building to do my job. I'm so intrigued by that, but it's predicting the future. And I think the more I have these conversations, the more I come to wrestle with how problematic predicting the future is. Maybe if I could pull us back to Janet, I think it was in your very first comment, you kind of framed leadership and uncertainty as this context where there's, you know, the personal psychological response. So who am I as a person who's, you know, in this world, in this moment? And then the plus of leadership is I'm this person in this world, in this moment, and also dealing with everyone else's being in this world, in this moment, and having, you know, some responsibility for maybe not shaping the response of others, but for, at a very minimum, in keeping with this conversation, shaping the kind of information people have, or shaping how you communicate in a time of uncertainty. So from an information standpoint, it's interesting that we've really discussed so much about the inputs and the outputs in a kind of informational frame of reference. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I want to kind of toss that back into your court if there's anything about either about the power of the status quo to return or not, if you feel like prognosticating about the future, or about this piece of really thinking through leadership as information management's probably not the right word, but definitely a information steward, and how leadership demands that one way or another you're communicating something. Does that spark anything for anyone? And maybe since there's 6 of us and 10 minutes left, if you want to take any of that, or if you have something you absolutely feel like you need to say that haven't been able to say yet, let's go through a final round in closing. And whoever wants to kick us off, go ahead and go for it.
So James, I'll be quick, and I'll take the prognostication bit. I wrote a paper 5 years ago in the midst of the Ebola outbreak that pointed to the past 15 or so years, where after every outbreak, we say, this is a wake-up call. And we did not wake up after every single one of those, right? This is, of course, much bigger. It's profound. Its scope is more profound, but I'm worried, I think, like you are. We had a lot of divestment in public health in the late 1990s in Ontario, which ultimately led to an E. coli outbreak, which ultimately limited our response to SARS in Toronto. And that had an immediate effect where we invested quite a bit in public health, where we developed new agencies and oversight in public health. And just before this pandemic, we saw divestments in public health again, right? So that was about 15, 16 years until we sort of forgot the importance of public health, started divesting again. So I'm a little cynical about the longevity, the sustainability of some of the lessons that we're learning in this pandemic.
Similarly, so I work, I'm a public servant, and so the analogy I've been using to talk about the changes to the organization is Titanic. So there have been different groups in different pockets of the public service working to make change and do culture shift for a very long time, and with different degrees of success. And then what's happened now is that the icebergs hit us. Right? So the icebergs hit us, and it has changed our course. Right? So it didn't breach the hull; it's just pushed us in a very different direction. And the question now is how do we resist that inertia of the status quo? Like how do we keep going in the direction that we've gone? Because the answer is not to turn the Titanic back around and go back towards another iceberg, right? And I think that the skills that we're practicing in this moment are going to help us with that, right? Like with the comfort and the even like doing the whole agile cycle and needing to get out with solutions very quickly and using tests that may not be perfect, but we're improving them. And so it's forced us in a direction that I think that I want to go optimistic and say that the momentum is strong, and that there are enough people who have been frustrated with the Titanic for long enough that those are the folks who are rising, and those are the folks who are going to keep us moving in that direction. So I'm optimistic that we will resist that inertia, and I know that it's strong, but I think that the iceberg has pushed us off. So let's keep on going that direction.
So I'm just quickly going to say this, which is picking up on Max's point. There's a professor in this country called Professor Mandel who wrote a paper or a piece on his blog linking climate change with the outbreak of coronavirus. Now, this is going to sound awfully crass, but I don't think this is bad enough for us to make a course correction. I think we're going to get through this, we're going to move on, and we'll be back to, yes, economies are going to be depressed, people are going to lose their jobs, but I honestly don't think that we're going to see any massive changes around the world. You know, in fact, I think we've seen a lessening of things in terms of environmental standards and everything else, because the governments will see that as a way of recovery. So I think we may be changed individually, but from a corporate or political level, I don't see those sorts of conversations. And the conversations we're having here are very much similar to the ones I'm having in other places. But I think from a governmental point of view or a politicization point, that isn't the conversation that's being had, or certainly I'm not picking up on it to a significant degree. So I very much agree with what Max is saying, and you're obviously much better informed than any of us on this. And I can't see, to be honest with you, even allowing horrendous numbers both in the US and the UK and in your own countries. I just can't see us making that bigger change, which is, I know, sadly depressing, but I just don't see it.
I have two things that I'll add. I think that I'm starting to see sparks of people wanting to take on issues and start advocating for what the future can look like. I think that we're in this in-between state, and I think the truth is we're going to be in a lot of unknowing for a long time. So to even get into the certainties of what the future looks like, I think we need to actually get comfortable with, we're going to be sitting more in the ambiguity and the unknown, but it's more, are we open to be informed by this time? And are there places where we can start doing some advocacy? So the conversation around, will we have different policy related to how we deal with people living in poverty, or around inclusion? I think, and it's starting, I'm seeing people starting to put some energy there. So I think that this is the time to start, because if the governments and policymakers are not hearing us say the world needs to be different coming out of this, and to Max's point, we have seen this pattern before, what will we do differently? So I think for the people that have the ability to be that voice and bring that leadership, that is vital. The other thing, just as this is sort of like a little bit of a tip, or sort of like something that I think leaders can be doing in a time like this right now, which is asking people, what is giving them a sense of purpose right now? Because I think that that's a grounding place, but I think it's also a place, if that is giving you a sense of purpose, how can that be part of your emerging future and where you'll put your leadership and your energy and your voice and your efforts? So I think those are the places to kind of, if people are kind of in the middle zone of uncertainty, it's like, that's a grounding question, but it points maybe a little bit to the future, not in such a grand way that it's inaccessible, but it may help awaken things and get people talking in different ways.
I think too, I'm not as optimistic about long-term change. I'm fearful that, in my experience, we deal with a lot of people who see things as sacrifice and aren't willing to make a lot of sacrifices. And don't really, I talk a lot about like opportunity cost, and are we willing to give something up to get something? And I'm fearful that people will see this as the sacrifice, and then as things start to come back to normal, they'll say, no, I gave it up. I did that already. And now I get to just move, I'm good, now I move forward. And that's where we'll lose some of that longevity. And I'm generalizing, I think there will be some amazing things that come from this, because there's going to be those top 10% or those top 20% who will try to push through and create change. and will work really hard to try and pull the others along. I had, and I'm conscious of time, I had a conversation with somebody yesterday in the Middle East, and it was really interesting to have a conversation with him because he was in one country and his wife got stuck in another country, and so they're separated right now, and she's in a pretty dangerous place. And he said to me, he said, well, she'll be here soon, I hope. And I went into my North American world, or my very privileged world of soon. And soon to me is soon. Like it's this week, it's next week, it's soon. And I said, oh, so when do you figure? And he said, probably about 3-4 months. And it was just interesting to me because that's not where I would put soon. But to him, in his life and his experience, that was soon. And so I just think that that's where I think we could have some challenges going forward is people's definition of what I'm willing to give up in order to get more. I think we've lived a very privileged life, and to give up some of that privilege in order to do better. I hate to be not optimistic because I'm a really optimistic person, but I'm not as optimistic in that space.
Well, I thank everyone for being, if not optimistic, realistic. And I think that coming back to an earlier thread in this conversation, I think realism is, I want to think realism is correlated with honesty. So I appreciate that we can, say, you know what, we don't know. This could go so many different ways, and it's almost part and parcel of the theme itself. To embrace that, to think about how we move forward in that context. But I will say one thing that is certain for me is that it's one amazing thing from this pandemic. It's been the opportunity to have conversations like this with you. I'm really thankful for your willingness to say yes to a rather cryptic invitation that invited you to come and talk about what you did not know. Thank you for your grace with entertaining that. It's been a really valuable conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your input. So Kendra, Janet, Melissa, Max, and Julian, thank you so much for contributing to this kind of this larger thought project, and hopefully something that I think is I want it to be ongoing. So if you have further reflections as you reflect on this conversation, please reach out and let's think about how that can continue. So the next conversation in this series is Monday. So that's June 1st. We'll be doing Monday and Tuesday this coming week at 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, if you're interested in joining us live. And then the last conversation in this series, or what is currently scheduled for the last conversation in the series, is this coming Wednesday at noon. So all that's left for me to do is just to say thank you to all of you once again for being a part of this. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody.
Good to meet you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so
Stay
much.
well.
Yeah. Take care. Happy pandemic.